Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And here's one you guys have been requesting. Matangi by M.I.A. Now, a couple of months ago, I did a retrospective review of Shaking the Habitual by The Knife, a critically acclaimed album that I didn't quite like as much as nearly all the other critics did. And there's a very good reason for that. That album, despite some very solid ambient pieces that I found really quite stirring, the lyrics and the delivery had the subtlety of a brick through the window. But more importantly, The Knife were trying to be very, very political on that album, and they were using their anti-commercialism in instrumentation to emphasize how difficult it would be for the average listener to accept those paradigm changes. But at the same time, that ended up being a rather fatal flaw for the album, because in doing so, they killed any sort of real populist appeal that they might have been able to drum up. In the heavy-handed message-mongering of the album, The Knife utilized their instrumentation to hammer home their point, a point that ultimately turned out just to be bog-standard left-wing criticisms of family values, a whole additional context of environmentalism, and it really offered nothing new to the cultural discourse. And by killing any sort of broader appeal, they only embodied the worst traits of snobbish artists with a message and proved more than a little insufferable for me, even though I ultimately agreed with the message that they were trying to present. See, here's the thing about political music. While politics offer a whole load of fascinating and captivating topics, it's hard to make political music that sounds anything close to good. It's a balancing act between the intellectual nuance that needs to be brought to the table to be taken remotely seriously, and the populist appeal to speak to a broader audience so that they be able to understand what the artists are trying to communicate. And believe me, it's very hard to maintain that balance, and it's why I maintain that one of the best political bands was the anarcho-punk collective Chumbawamba, mostly because they balanced their hard-edged and smartly articulated political messages with simple melodies, a lot of wit, great hooks, and a fundamental spirit of we're all in this together. Even if you disagreed with the politics, which at several points I very much did, I don't think that you can argue that the delivery of their message was rather ingenious. And yet, I had to admit I was more than a little skeptical when I heard about M.I.A. and her new album Matangi. She had made no secret of the fact that she's a very political artist with a message, and that she had very solid pop sensibilities. I mean, the critics sure seem to think so, given the rave reviews that her albums have tended to receive, and yet, until I reviewed this album, I had no interest whatsoever in M.I.A. I mean, I'd heard Paper Planes and I'd heard Boys, and I thought, nope, don't need any of that. Those songs are incredibly vapid and obnoxious. But then I figured, hey, I was probably being unfair without knowing greater context, and there isn't much coming out this month anyway, so I figured I would go through M.I.A.'s discography and give her a very fair chance. And look, maybe it's just not for me. Look, I respect what she's trying to do, and I can't deny that she has a gift for genre-hopping sound collages that will be unlike anything you're ever going to hear in the mainstream. But it's not clicking for me, and I know exactly why. Now, part of it's her voice. It's just not my thing. I can accept that. Part of it's her delivery. I'm going to come back to this more, because it never feels raw enough or emotionally drawn enough to really get to me and really get under my skin. And part of it is that the lyrics, they're just not very good. They don't work nearly as well as they should. Yes, they are descriptive. Yes, they fit the tone of the instrumentation and the production. But there's no nuance here and very little populism. It's unbridled and straightforward, incredibly so, and yet lacks the energy and driving force to justify the simplicity of the approach, almost to the point of propagandizing the far-left attitudes that M.I.A. sings about. And while the emotional response, it can be compelling, to me it feels shallow, a stark painting that might put forward an interesting image, but lacking in any sort of greater dimension. But you know what? Maybe that's enough. Her first album, Erolar, was very much in this vein, and it wasn't bad, even though its lack of cohesiveness did really show. Then again, that might have been part of the point. Her second album, Kala, was a fair bit better, with Jimmy being the standout track for me for actually having a good melody worth remembering. But then again, the inclusion of more electronica to create a more cohesive sound, it felt like some of the texture and some of the rawness that had characterized elements of Erolar was jettisoned, which really wasn't a good sign. But then again, the loss of texture should have been the last thing I was concerned about with her next album, M.I.A, which seemed to be M.I.A.'s attempt to fuse internet-inspired industrial music with her usual shtick, and all it ended up doing was giving me a massive migraine. Not only did the lyrics prove that M.I.A had nothing interesting or all that insightful to say about the internet, the instrumentation lost any sort of cohesion and only amplified the klaxon-esque howling that has always been the worst part of M.I.A.'s instrumentation. I can imagine like industrial musicians like Trent Reznor coming onto this album and muttering, who the hell is responsible for this messy, incoherent, poorly mixed, and painfully shallow nonsense? And this is coming from Trent Reznor. Watch my hesitation marks review if you want to get an idea how I feel about him. Now, to be fair, that's probably the first album that came anywhere remotely close to backing M.I.A.'s continued assertions that she's inspired by hardcore punk, and songs like Meds and Feds were easily the best songs on the record, but look, that's not saying much. And really, after M.I.A, I was a little optimistic for Matangi. I mean, it can't get worse than that, right? Well, it wasn't worse than M.I.A. In fact, it was a little better than I was expecting. Now, that's not saying that this album is anywhere close to great, or it's something that I'm actually going to like or listen to coming after this review, but it's not precisely bad in the same way that her last album was. But at the same time, it's the sort of work that definitely feels like it was a troubled production, which it was, and even for M.I.A.'s traditional lack of cohesion on her records, that's saying something. I can tell that it feels troubled. And yet, somehow, this is probably M.I.A.'s least interesting album to date, at least for me. And it's not precisely bad, but it gets boring, and that's perhaps worse for an artist like M.I.A. So, okay, let's start with instrumentation and production, which is thankfully nowhere near as bad as her last album, but really that's not saying much. It has the distinctive M.I.A. sound, and if you're a fan of that sound with a lot of Asian and Indian-inspired rhythms crossed with trap-inspired instrumentation, electronica, and a whole load of extraneous sound effects that just do nothing for the mix, you'll probably like the sound of this record, which is a more relaxed and less frenetic version of the sound that she had on Arular and Kala. But unlike those albums, the mess just seems a lot less tolerable for me this time around. It doesn't have the same amount of energy, and that can be linked to two big problems. Number one, the production feels a whole lot slicker and with a lot less texture, and the fact that the tempo overall being a lot slower only highlights the cracks in the production even further. It doesn't help matters that most of the songs just drag painfully and don't have enough ideas to explain their running time, even with M.I.A. throwing as many musical ideas and samples at the tracks as she possibly can. Now, she can sometimes get results here. The heavy sample from The Weeknd on Exodus creates a pretty good vibe, and one that I liked, but then she goes and she just beats the idea into the ground with a follow-up album closer, Sexodus, which is a slightly rewritten version of that song that just feels like excess bloat. It's not needed on the album, and frankly, I have a hard time buying into M.I.A.'s that she considers this album upbeat, because in comparison with the motley explosions of Arular and Kala, Matangi just feels rather sluggish. Now, of course, some of that has to do with M.I.A. herself, and here's where I finally figured out my big issue with her delivery. She never sounds like she cares or she's all that invested in her material. She might have personal causes that might mean a great deal to her, but her deadpan, her occasional lack of energy, and her preference for all these vocal effects and auto-tune just all serve to strip away any sort of feeling that she gives a damn about any things that she's actually rapping about. And sure, while it might be fine for dead-eyed party music and dance jams, it really doesn't work when she's trying to make political statements or come across as having the slight attitude of punk. It also seriously dampens any sort of populist appeal that she might have. If she never sounds like she cares, why should we care? And that becomes all the more problematic on Matangi, because with the slower tempo, M.I.A. just sounds like she cares even less. And considering that she's never been that great of a rapper, sorry, it's true, it exposes her flaws even further. And the scary fact is that might actually be partially intentional. Now, here's where I'm going to give M.I.A. the one very big compliment that she definitely deserves with this album. The comparison that she's drawing between herself and the Hindu goddess Matangi is kind of inspired, and it does make a lot of sense. Matangi is the goddess of music and knowledge and the arts, and has been described throughout traditional Hindu culture as the outcast, or one of the outcast goddesses. And really, the way that M.I.A. presents herself throughout the past decade, you know what? It fits with the image, and as I said, it makes way too much sense. And it's a complete shame that M.I.A. does precisely squat with this. She references the goddess, and she references karma throughout the album, but she never does anything all that that special with it outside of her typical purview. Bragging, talking about being a bad girl to the point of celebrating it, and overwrought and controversial political statements that are so shallow and devoid of nuance that they might as well just be talking points. And at this point, I can't help but feel like M.I.A. is just treading old ground, and not in a particularly interesting or compelling way. That's not even counting songs like Attention, which is a song reportedly written with the aid of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks infamy, who, to quote M.I.A. directly, came into the studio and took my computer and basically decrypted the whole of the internet and downloaded every word of the whole language that contained the word tent in it, and then she used that to write a song. Yeah, really, that happened. That brings really, that whole statement encapsulates the forefront of my biggest issue with M.I.A. as an artist, and with this album specifically. She clearly thinks that everything that she writes is important and deep and incredibly meaningful, when the nuance and depth and emotional resonance has never really materialized. Now, to be fair, this myopic conceit can occasionally work and bring some of that bratty attitude to shallow pop songs and give them some unique character. That's why songs like Jimmy and Paper Planes actually kind of work. But if she's going to try to make statements about spirituality or politics or technology, she just comes across as hopelessly out of her depth. She's enamored with the concepts, but the understanding behind those concepts is just isn't there, or at least it's not articulated as if she understands them. She might actually understand them. I'll give her the benefit of the doubt here, but her music certainly doesn't portray her as understanding it. And her usage of pop culture references at this point, it just comes across as desperate, particularly on Yala, a surface level refutation of Drake's insufferable song from 18 months ago. I'm not one of those critics who's going to call it out for being dated, but when you're dealing with a pretty shallow song to begin with, you're not refuting an even shallower one doesn't help you. Then she compares herself with Lara Croft from the Tomb Raider games and from the movie, which I don't mind the comparison, but if you're familiar with the video games at all, you'd realize that's not a positive comparison in the slightest. Or, you know what? Let's frame this another way. In her song Bring the Noise, one of the few upbeat songs on the album, and one of the songs I actually kind of dug, M.I.A. brags about her art showing up in search results on Bing. I shouldn't even have to describe how poor of a reference that is, and it just doesn't work. Now look, let's wrap this up. M.I.A.'s Matangi, it might not be as bad as M.I.A., but it's another frustratingly shallow album from an artist who I'm starting to think is stagnating artistically. Look, I'll give her credit for going towards the spirituality angle with a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more insight and cultural relevance than what Katy Perry tried to do, but she fails harder here because it's not as if her results are any better. It's not as if she uses that spirituality material to make any sort of grand statements or anything that's actually edifying or have a significant point. Like with Katy Perry, M.I.A. is just better at making shallow pop songs than statements with any sort of importance or depth. And believe it or not, that's not really a criticism of her, it's just pointing out what her strengths are. And when she goes in that direction on Matangi, the songs are actually halfway decent. I liked Warriors, and you know what? Even if she's going for a more ballad-esque direction, Exodus, it kind of works. As for the album as a whole, though, look, it's a 5 out of 10 for me, and I find it really hard to recommend this album. And look, before you all jump down my throat, I get that M.I.A.'s music is definitely not marketed at for me. As I said before, this music is not my style, it's not for me, and it might have greater cultural relevance and resonance for different demographics. So take all of what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm doing this review because you guys requested it. But you know what? Even with that in mind, I can't help that those demographics that M.I.A. is pointed to, can't help but feel that they deserve better than this. I'd recommend you skip this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be very grateful for it. Yeah, I'm expecting I'm probably gonna get a lot of negative feedback for this review. I understand that, but as I said, I tried to like it. It didn't speak to me. I'm sorry, guys. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my setup, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to take a listen to, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.